It is the year 1600. You have a bad bruise. Your doctor writes you a prescription. You take it to the pharmacist. He reaches behind the counter, pulls out a small dark jar, measures out a careful amount of brown powder, wraps it in paper, and hands it to you. You take it home. You mix it into wine as directed, and you drink it. What you just swallowed is ground up Egyptian mummy. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. The actual desiccated, centuries-old remains of a human being imported from Egypt, ground into powder, and sold as medicine in a respectable European pharmacy. And nobody thought this was unusual, because it wasn't. For almost 400 years, this was completely normal. Stay until the end, because the reason this practice finally stopped is not what you would expect. The substance had a name, MUMIA, and the story of how it came to mean ground up human beings is one of the most bizarre chains of misunderstanding in medical history. It begins in the medieval Islamic world, where physicians wrote about a natural bituminous substance, a dark, tar-like material found seeping from rocks in certain regions of the Middle East. This substance was believed to have powerful medicinal properties. It was called mumia from the Persian word for wax or bitumen. It was real, it was used, and by many accounts, it was genuinely useful as a wound sealant. But then something went wrong. European scholars translating Arabic medical texts encountered descriptions of this dark, tar-like substance, and they noticed that Egyptian mummies were also dark, also bitumen-coated in some cases, also ancient. The conclusion they reached was entirely logical, entirely wrong, and catastrophic for the mummies of Egypt. They decided that the bodies themselves were the medicine. By the 12th century, the trade was underway. European merchants and physicians began importing Egyptian mummies, or parts of them, as medical ingredients. At first, the demand was modest. A few well-connected physicians, a few wealthy patients. But by the 16th century, mumia had become one of the most commonly listed ingredients in European pharmacopoeias, the official medical reference books used by physicians and pharmacists across the continent. It appeared in the standard medical texts of France, England, Germany, and the Netherlands. It was not underground, it was not fringe, it was mainstream medicine recommended by the most respected physicians of the era, including figures whose other medical work we still consider significant today. Francis Bacon wrote about it, Paracelsus endorsed it. The French surgeon Ambroise Paré, considered one of the fathers of modern surgery, was one of the few voices who openly criticized it and he was largely ignored. So what exactly was mumia supposed to cure? Almost everything. Bruising. This was one of the most common uses. Mumia was believed to reknit damaged flesh from the inside. Epilepsy, ground mummy, was listed as a treatment for seizures in several major medical texts. Headaches, paralysis, gout, ulcers, skin conditions, internal bleeding. The logic followed the same principle that ran through much of pre-modern medicine. Substances that had survived for thousands of years must contain some extraordinary, concentrated life force. Something that could restore what illness had taken. A mummy, after all, had lasted millennia. Surely something inside it could help the living. It was wrong. It was also, from the perspective of the people prescribing it, completely internally coherent. If history this strange and this well-documented is what you are here for, subscribe right now. We cover exactly this every single week. This was not a practice limited to the poor or the desperate. King Francis I of France reportedly carried a small personal supply of mumia powder wherever he went, mixed with rhubarb to take in case of emergency. Queen Elizabeth I is said to have used it. So did her physicians. Manuscripts from royal courts across Europe list mumia in the personal medical supply inventories of monarchs and aristocrats. This was luxury medicine. It was expensive. It was prestigious. And the more rare and ancient the mummy, the higher the price and the greater the perceived power. Being able to afford mumia was, in a grim way, a status symbol. This is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. The demand was enormous. The supply was finite. Egyptian authorities, when they paid attention, were hostile to the trade. So an industry emerged around sourcing mummies as quickly and cheaply as possible. Tomb raiders stripped mummies from ancient burial sites across Egypt, loading them onto ships bound for European ports. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the trade had become so aggressive that some historians estimate hundreds or even thousands of mummies were exported from Egypt per year at the peak of the practice. Ancient burial sites that had survived for millennia were systematically plundered within a few generations. But here's where it gets even darker. The demand eventually outpaced the supply of ancient mummies. And so, predictably, entrepreneurs found a solution. Fresh corpses, recently deceased people, often executed criminals, or in some documented cases, bodies acquired through even more disturbing means, were processed to look and smell like authentic ancient mummies. They were dried, treated with bitumen and resins, wrapped, aged to look older than they were, and then sold to European merchants as genuine ancient Egyptian mummies. A French physician named Guy de la Fontaine investigated the trade directly in the late 16th century. He visited a merchant in Alexandria who openly admitted that his entire stock was fake. Recently processed bodies passed off as ancient ones. De La Fontaine wrote about this with what appears to be genuine outrage. The merchant, by his account, seemed puzzled by the outrage. The Europeans wanted mummy powder. He provided mummy powder. What was the problem? The practice did not end suddenly. It faded gradually over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries as European medicine slowly shifted toward more empirical, evidence-based frameworks. The rise of chemistry and microscopy gave physicians better tools to understand what substances actually did in the body. And MUMIA, when examined through these new frameworks, did nothing. Nothing that could be measured, nothing that could be replicated. There was also a growing unease, not universally felt but slowly spreading, about the ethics of consuming human remains. By the early 1700s, it had largely disappeared from mainstream pharmacopoeias. Not banned, not scandalized out of existence, just quietly removed from the official lists. The way ideas sometimes die, not with outrage, but with a slow collective realization that they were always wrong. So here is what this story shows us. MUMIA was not practiced by ignorant people. It was practiced by the most educated physicians in the most advanced societies of the time, using the best available frameworks for understanding medicine. Those frameworks were wrong, but the people using them did not know they were wrong. They were doing exactly what trained, rational people do, following the best available knowledge. The lesson is not that medieval Europeans were foolish. The lesson is about the limits of any era's understanding of its own blind spots. Every generation believes it has finally arrived at accurate knowledge, and every generation, viewed from a sufficient distance, turns out to have had a version of the mummy powder problem, something completely normal, widely accepted, prescribed by experts, that later generations will look back at and find genuinely difficult to explain. The question worth sitting with is simple. What is ours? If that last question stayed with you, leave a comment. I genuinely read everyone. And if you want more history like this, dark, strange, and more relevant than it first appears, subscribe. New video every week. See you next time.